Imagine a quiet mountain town where a little girl's cry for safety echoed louder than the winter storm outside. A father once lost in his own silence is suddenly forced to choose, protect his children, or lose them forever. A loyal German shepherd stands as their guardian, ready to face the shadows no one else dares to fight. What would you do if darkness came to your very doorstep? Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop a comment below, and may your day be filled with light, warmth, and blessings. The town of Pine Hollow lay buried under winter's grip, its narrow streets lined with skeletal trees whose branches bowed beneath layers of heavy snow. The Montana wind slashed down from the mountains with a keening whistle that rattled shutters and shook window panes. At the edge of town, where the lights of the diner and the gas station could barely be seen from a distance, stood the Cole residence, a two-story wooden house with its paint faded to a pale gray. Though it was solidly built, the place carried an air of weariness, as though it too grieved alongside its inhabitants. 6 months had passed since the funeral that left the family hollow, and inside the walls of this house, warmth seemed to flicker and falter like a candle near its end. Ethan Cole, the master of the house, was Pine Hollow's sheriff. At 41, he wore the years like a uniform, broad-shouldered, tall, with storm-gray eyes that had once held a steady calm, but now carried shadows darker than the Montana winter nights. His hair, once a rich chestnut, had begun to gray at the temples, streaks that came not from age alone, but from long days of burden and long nights haunted by loss. He had been a devoted husband to Clara, his late wife, who had died during childbirth, and since then, Ethan had buried himself in his duties, patrolling the streets, managing his deputies, and chasing down threads of crime that seemed to creep into even the quietest towns. To the townsfolk, he was the law, stoic and firm. To his children, however, he was increasingly a stranger. Ethan thought himself protecting them by working, but in truth, he was running, from grief, from guilt, from the memory of Clara's smile. Emily Cole, his eldest, was only 8, but carried the weight of someone much older. She had her mother's eyes, a striking shade of hazel flecked with green, and her mother's dark hair, though hers now often fell untidily across her pale cheeks. Once she had been a lively child, quick to laugh, eager to hold her father's hand during evening walks. But since Clara's death, her laughter had dimmed. She was slender, her frame small enough that she often seemed fragile, but there was a quiet determination in the way she straightened her shoulders when scolded, or in the way she clutched her baby brother close. Emily had begun to understand too early what it meant to be both child and caretaker. Her heart longed for her father's embrace, yet each time he brushed past her with, "Not now, sweetheart," something inside her curled inward, retreating to silence. Noah, the infant, was barely a year old. His cheeks were round, flushed against the cold, his hair fine and soft, more golden than his mother's or sister's. He was too young to remember Clara, too young to recognize the void her absence left, and so he giggled and cried without comprehension of the heaviness around him. He was innocence itself, the fragile reminder of what had been lost, but also, perhaps, of what might still be saved. Into this fractured household had stepped Scarlett Ward, Clara's older sister. Scarlett was in her late 30s, tall and lean, with sharp features that seemed always caught between beauty and cruelty. Her auburn hair, often pinned back severely, framed a face with piercing green eyes that could have been warm had life shaped her differently. But Scarlett's history was a trail of disappointments, failed marriages, debts she could never quite manage, and a bitterness that grew like a shadow over her soul. When Clara died, Scarlett had insisted on staying at the Cole house, under the pretense of helping with the children. At first, Ethan, drowning in grief and work, accepted, grateful for any aid. But Scarlett's help quickly curdled into dominance. She carried herself with authority, issuing commands to the household staff, criticizing Emily at every turn, and speaking with a harshness that stung. To Scarlett, the Cole home was both a roof and a stage upon which she could finally wield power she had never owned elsewhere. The servants, too, felt her reign. Teresa Marlowe, the housekeeper, had served the family for nearly 2 decades. She was a small woman in her 60s, with hair now white and hands rough from years of scrubbing, cooking, and caring. She had been loyal to Clara and now watched over the children with quiet devotion, though age slowed her steps. Her kindness was gentle, but her spine was not without steel. Still, she knew the limits of her station and often swallowed words that burned at the back of her throat whenever Scarlett raised her voice. Alongside her worked Camilla Rhodes, a young maid of 20, with soft brown hair always falling from its braid and a timid smile that rarely appeared these days. Camilla was earnest, willing, but easily cowed by authority. Scarlett's cruelty weighed heavily on both women, yet they endured, if only for the sake of Emily and Noah. Among them all moved Rook, Ethan's German shepherd. 6 years old, large and muscular, his black and silver coat gleamed even in the dim winter light. His amber eyes were sharp, alert to every sound, every movement, every shift in the household air. Once trained for patrol work, Rook had been Ethan's partner during late-night rounds in Pine Hollow. But in the house, Rook seemed to adopt a different role, guardian of the children. He often followed Emily, padding softly behind her small steps, lying near her crib when she read to Noah, or positioning himself between Scarlett and the children whenever voices rose. There was an intelligence in his gaze, as if he understood far more than a mere animal should, as if he carried the soul of a sentinel who had chosen his duty. That evening, as the storm clawed at the windows, Scarlett's voice sliced through the silence of the house. "Emily, where are you hiding it? Don't play dumb with me." Her heels clicked across the hardwood floors as she stormed into the parlor, her cheeks flushed with rage. Emily stood clutching Noah tightly, her small arms wrapped around his body, as though she could shield him from all harm. Scarlett loomed over them, green eyes flashing. 8 years old and already so sly. Do you think I'm blind? You've been sneaking coins, haven't you? Emily's lips trembled. I don't have anything. Please leave us alone. Her voice was thin, nearly swallowed by the crackling of the fire. She pressed her cheek to Noah's head, as if his softness could lend her courage. Scarlett sneered. "Liar!" She reached forward, her fingers twitching as if she might tear the child's belongings apart. At that moment, a low growl rumbled across the room. Rook stepped forward, hackles raised, teeth bared. His stance was rigid, protective, his amber eyes blazing like fire. For an instant, Scarlett froze, but her pride would not allow retreat. "Back, mutt!" she snapped, swinging her arm as though to strike. Emily gasped, clutching Noah tighter. "Please," she whispered again, tears brimming in her eyes. "Please, just stop." In the shadows, Teresa watched from the doorway, her wrinkled hands tightening on the edge of her apron. Camilla stood behind her, wide-eyed, whispering a prayer under her breath. Neither dared to intervene. Scarlett's wrath was too sharp, too swift. But their hearts ached as Emily's desperate plea echoed through the house, a cry too fragile for walls so cold. Far away, in the sheriff's office downtown, Ethan was finishing paperwork by the dim light of his desk lamp. He rubbed his eyes, weariness etched into the lines of his face. Outside, the snow drifted against the station windows, and Marcus, his deputy, called goodnight before stepping into the storm. Ethan sat alone, unaware that his children, only a few miles away, were being swallowed by fear. He thought he was buying them safety with his long hours, but in truth, he was leaving them to face shadows without him. In Pine Hollow, the night deepened. Scarlett's voice still thundered, Emily's sobs still broke, and Rook's growl still rumbled steady as stone. And though Ethan had not yet seen the truth with his own eyes, the cry of his daughter lingered in the house like a ghost, waiting for the day it would reach him and shake him awake. The storm deepened as the hours dragged on in Pine Hollow. Wind shrieked around corners, rattling every window in the Cole residence, as though nature itself conspired to amplify the unease within the house. In the parlor, the fire burned low, its embers casting thin light across the wooden floor, where Emily clutched Noah in her arms. Her small frame quivered under the weight of fear. Scarlett loomed above her, green eyes flashing with unrestrained fury, while the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to count down the seconds to some unseen breaking point. Rook stood between them, hackles bristling, a living barrier of fur and muscle. The German shepherd's amber eyes glowed with warning, his body taut, every nerve ready to defend. His thick black and silver coat rippled as he shifted, a growl vibrating in his chest like distant thunder. Scarlet snarled at the dog. "Out of my way, beast!" She raised a hand as if to strike, but the sight of bared teeth froze her mid-motion. She spat curses instead, her pride unwilling to bow. Emily's voice cracked through the room, trembling, desperate. "Please, please leave us alone." The words were not merely a plea, but a cry pulled from the depths of her fragile heart, heavy with the longing for protection she had been denied. Teresa, the housekeeper, stood just beyond the archway, her wrinkled hands pressed to her chest as though to hold in the pain of helplessness. Camilla lingered at her side, the young maid's eyes wide, lips moving soundlessly in prayer. Neither woman dared step forward, their fear of Scarlet's temper shackling their courage. Far across town, Sheriff Ethan Cole drove home from the station. Snow swirled through the headlights of his patrol truck, cloaking the world in a curtain of white. His deputy Marcus had urged him to rest earlier, noting the deep grooves under Ethan's eyes, but the sheriff had brushed it off. Work was the only place he felt in control. Yet tonight something gnawed at him, a strange pull, as though the storm itself whispered that his family needed him. The truck's tires crunched over icy gravel as he approached the house. Scarlet, meanwhile, paced the room, her anger growing reckless. She raged about missing money, her words sharp and venomous, until the baby began to cry. Noah's wails filled the house, piercing and raw. Emily rocked him gently, whispering to soothe, but Scarlet's shout rose above it all. "You ungrateful brat! You think you can hide things from me?" She lunged forward, but Rook barked, the sound explosive in the tight space, causing her to recoil. For a moment, her mask of control cracked, revealing not authority, but desperation. It was then that the front door burst open. Snowflakes rushed inside as Ethan stepped across the threshold, tall and imposing in his dark sheriff's jacket, his face stern from years of discipline. His storm-gray eyes, however, widened at the sight before him. Emily's tears glistened on her pale cheeks. Noah's cries shook her small arms, Scarlet's fists were clenched, and Rook's growl still reverberated in the air. The house that had once been filled with laughter now roared with chaos. "Scarlet!" Ethan's voice boomed, not the calm authority of a sheriff in control, but the raw command of a father who had just seen his child in danger. "What is going on here?" The words slammed into the room like a hammer blow. Scarlet faltered, stepping back, her face paling under his gaze. She opened her mouth to twist the scene, to accuse Emily, but Ethan's glare silenced her. For the first time in months, he was present, not as an officer, but as a father. Emily's small voice broke through sobs. "Daddy, don't let her scold Noah anymore." Her hazel green eyes, wet with tears, locked on his, pleading not just for her brother, but for herself. The sound shattered Ethan's carefully built walls of numbness. Those words, so fragile, so piercing, lodged deep within his chest. He realized with brutal clarity how absent he had been, and how blind he had remained to the suffering inside his own home. Scarlet stammered, "Ethan, she's lying, she's manipulative, But her words fell apart under the weight of his gaze. His voice, though steady, was edged with cold steel. "Enough. You've said enough." Scarlet staggered back, eyes blazing with humiliation and hatred, before storming from the room. Her footsteps echoed down the hallway like the retreat of a defeated tyrant. Teresa stepped forward then, tears glistening on her cheeks. She did not speak. She did not need to. The truth had been witnessed. Camilla covered her mouth, sobbing quietly, relief mingling with the residue of fear. Rook padded forward, pressing against Emily's side, his presence steady and grounding. Ethan knelt down slowly, reaching out toward Emily, but she recoiled, clutching Noah tighter, her small body stiff with mistrust. That flinch, subtle as it was, cut him deeper than any wound sustained in the years of service. He froze, his hand hovering in the air. He wanted to promise protection, to say that he would never leave her again, but words failed him. He realized promises would be hollow. Emily's trust had to be earned. Behind him, the storm continued to rage outside, battering the walls of the house. But inside, another storm had only just begun. The silence that followed Scarlet's retreat was not peace, but the aftermath of upheaval. Ethan rose slowly, his eyes on his daughter, who now looked away, her face half hidden in Noah's blanket. He could see her trembling shoulders, could hear her muffled sobs, and knew that the battle for her trust had only begun. He stood straighter, his jaw clenched, determination simmering beneath the exhaustion in his face. He turned briefly to Teresa, his voice low but firm. "Keep them safe. I'll speak with her later." Yet even as he said it, he knew the problem ran deeper than one confrontation. Scarlet had poisoned the house for too long. Later that night, Ethan sat in the dimly lit library, the storm muffled against thick glass windows. His hands rested heavily on the arms of the chair, but his mind replayed Emily's voice over and over. "Daddy, don't let her scold Noah anymore." It wasn't just a request. It was an accusation, a confession of fear, and a plea for salvation. His eyes burned as he stared into the shadows of the room. Rook lay curled near the fireplace, lifting his head occasionally, amber eyes following Ethan with quiet understanding. For all his years as a sheriff, Ethan had never felt more convicted than in that moment. He had sworn to protect Pine Hollow, but he had failed to protect his own blood. As midnight passed, Ethan stood and ascended the stairs. He paused outside the children's room, hand raised to knock. Through the thin wood, he could hear Noah's soft breaths and the faint rustle of Emily shifting in bed. His knuckles touched the door, but he hesitated, his throat tightening. He lowered his hand without a sound. Promises were not enough tonight. He would need to show her, day after day, that he would never abandon her again. Downstairs, Teresa whispered a quiet prayer as she extinguished the lamps. Camilla lingered near the window, watching the storm blow against the dark horizon, her thoughts racing with unease. Scarlett's departure had not felt final. It had felt like a retreat, a pause before another strike. Somewhere in the shadows of Pine Hollow, bitterness still simmered. But for now, within the quiet house, the echo of Emily's plea remained, reverberating like a bell in Ethan's heart. It was the sound that would not let him rest. The dawn came reluctantly to Pine Hollow, a weak gray light pushing against the heavy curtain of clouds that hung low over the valley. Snow still clung to rooftops and tree branches, its weight bending the world into silence. Inside the Cole residence, however, the silence was not peaceful, but strained, brittle as glass. Ethan sat at the kitchen table in uniform, his badge catching the dim light, while the steam from his untouched coffee curled upward and vanished. Across the room, Emily moved quietly, clutching Noah against her shoulder, her eyes never quite meeting her father's. Rook padded along the floor between them, the steady rhythm of his paws the only sound anchoring the space. Ethan wanted to speak, to bridge the gulf that had widened overnight, but Emily's body language kept him still. She avoided him with the precision of someone who had learned disappointment too many times. When he reached out gently to brush Noah's head, Emily shifted just enough to keep her brother between them, an unspoken shield. Ethan withdrew, his heart sinking, realizing that though Scarlet had been forced back the night before, the damage she had inflicted lingered like a shadow in every corner. At the sheriff's office later that morning, the world demanded Ethan's attention, as though nothing at home had changed. The deputies gathered for briefing, the air thick with tension, as news spread of a narcotics ring rumored to be operating along the county highway. Marcus Hale, Ethan's deputy, stood beside him, young, broad-shouldered, with sandy hair and a restlessness that made him seem always on the edge of pacing. Marcus respected Ethan, but wasn't afraid to voice concern. "Sheriff, people are whispering about shipments moving through old logging roads. If that's true, we're sitting on a fire we can't ignore." Ethan nodded, though his mind was split, his thoughts returning to Emily's tearful eyes. Still, he forced his focus to the task at hand. Justice outside the home could not excuse failure within it. In the corner of the station stood Officer Dana Whitmore, newly transferred from a neighboring county. Dana was in her mid-30s, with dark hair pulled back into a sharp ponytail and steel-blue eyes that measured every room she entered. She carried herself with the discipline of someone who had fought to earn every step, her posture erect, her uniform crisp. Life had not been kind. A childhood shaped by a father's absence had made her fiercely protective of children and quietly skeptical of men who abandoned responsibility. Ethan noticed her calm efficiency as she flipped through case files, but also the flicker of empathy when Marcus mentioned kids being caught up in drug houses. Dana's presence would soon ripple beyond the walls of the station. Back at the coal house, Teresa moved through the kitchen with her practiced motions, preparing porridge for Noah and tea for Emily. The older woman watched the children, with worry deepening the lines on her face. She had served this family through joy, and now through sorrow, and she sensed more clearly than anyone that Scarlett's venom had left wounds unseen. Camilla, bustling with clumsy eagerness, tried to lighten the mood by humming while sweeping, but her voice faltered whenever Emily walked past without smiling. Scarlett herself was nowhere to be seen that day, having vanished after her humiliation. Yet her absence brought no relief, only dread. Teresa muttered under her breath to Camilla, "Storms don't end when the sky clears. They wait." The younger maid shivered, nodding silently as though Scarlett's return were inevitable. By afternoon, Ethan returned home briefly between patrols. He found Emily sitting at the window, Noah in her lap, staring at the frost that laced the glass. Rook sat beside her, his head pressed against her knee. Ethan stood in the doorway, unsure whether to step closer. He wanted to ask her what she felt, to promise her that Scarlett would never raise her voice again, but the words tangled in his throat. Finally he managed, "Emily, do you want to have dinner together tonight? Just us?" For a fleeting second her eyes flickered with something, hope, perhaps, but she turned away quickly, whispering, "I'm not hungry." The rejection stung more than he expected, a subtle confirmation that his absence had left scars deeper than he could erase in a single gesture. That night, back at the station, Ethan pored over maps of the county. Marcus stood nearby, tracing roads with a pencil. "Sheriff, if the smugglers are moving shipments, they're using the same routes hunters take. Hard to patrol all that land with our numbers." Ethan rubbed a hand across his jaw, the weight of responsibility heavy. Rook, brought along to the station as he often was, lifted his head suddenly and let out a low growl, staring at the door. A man entered, Reverend Paul Granger, the town pastor. Paul was in his late 50s, his hair thinning, his round face usually softened by a ready smile. But tonight his expression was grave. He approached Ethan slowly, his hands folded as if in the prayer. "Sheriff," he said gently, "I came not only for the town, but for your daughter. She came by the churchyard yesterday, clutching her little brother. She didn't say a word, just sat there quietly until I approached. Children shouldn't look that old in their eyes." Ethan froze, his chest tightening. Shame burned in him, shame that others saw what he had ignored. Paul continued, his voice calm yet firm. "I know your burdens are heavy, but silence builds walls around children, walls harder to tear down than any criminal fortress. Don't let her grow up behind them." Dana, who had been listening from her desk, looked up sharply, her steel blue eyes softening for once. She gave a single nod, as though echoing the Reverend's truth. Later, when Ethan drove home, the streets glistened with ice beneath the dim streetlights. He parked outside the house, the engine ticking in the cold, and sat motionless for several minutes. Inside, he knew Emily would be awake still, pretending to read, but really listening for every footstep in the hallway. He had faced armed men, drug runners, and countless storms, but never had he felt more unsteady than at the thought of knocking on his daughter's door. Inside the house, Emily tucked Noah into bed. She whispered softly to him, stories her mother once told, half-remembered fairy tales about forests and brave knights. Rook lay nearby, his amber eyes half-closed, ears twitching at every sound. Emily glanced toward the hallway, where a shadow passed beneath the crack of the door. She stiffened, hugging her knees. When the shadow lingered, she held her breath. But no knock came, only silence, heavy and suffocating. She pressed her forehead to her knees, whispering to herself, "Don't leave me alone anymore," though no one heard. Ethan finally walked away from her door, retreating downstairs where Teresa sat darning socks by lamplight. She looked up, her eyes weary but kind. "Sheriff," she said quietly, "children don't measure love in promises. They measure it in presence." He nodded, unable to respond, then sank heavily into a chair, Rook placing his head on his knee, as if to steady him. Outside, the snow began again, falling soft and relentless, covering Pine Hollow in another blanket of silence. The coal house remained lit that night, but its halls were filled with the unspoken distance between father and daughter. Scarlett's voice no longer thundered, yet the echo of her cruelty lingered, etched into Emily's silence. Ethan realized he was no longer only fighting criminals beyond the town's borders. He was fighting to tear down the walls his neglect had built inside his own home. The snow had ceased by morning, but the world outside remained coated in a crust of white that reflected the pale winter sun. Pine Hollow looked almost serene under its blanket, but within the coal house the air still carried unease. Emily sat at the dining table, small hands folded over her lap, her eyes fixed on the steam rising from her untouched porridge. Across from her, Ethan sipped black coffee in silence, his badge clipped to his belt, his mind torn between two wars, the one in town and the one inside his own home. Rook lay stretched beneath the table, amber eyes watchful, tail occasionally thumping when Emily shifted in her chair. After breakfast, Ethan left for the sheriff's office, though every step away from the house felt like a betrayal. He drove the patrol truck into town, the road salted but slick. At the office, Marcus Hale was already waiting, tapping his pencil against a map pinned to the wall. "Sheriff, another report came in," he said, his voice brisk. "A logger found tire tracks leading to the old quarry, same place hunters claimed they heard engines last week." Ethan studied the map, his jaw tightening. The quarry was secluded, the kind of place traffickers would use for storage. Officer Dana Whitmore entered soon after, carrying a folder. She looked composed as always, dark hair drawn back, uniform sharp, steel blue eyes that missed little. "Sheriff, I interviewed a teenager we pulled in last night for trespassing. Kid claims he saw trucks unloading at the quarry after midnight. He might be unreliable, but his story fits the timeline." She handed over the report, her movements crisp. Ethan nodded, then asked, "Did he mention names?" Dana shook her head. "No names, but he described one of the drivers, a woman with auburn hair, slim build, green eyes." Ethan froze, his mind flashing immediately to Scarlett. The description matched too closely to ignore. At that moment, the door to the station opened and in stepped a woman wrapped in a heavy coat, her face pale against the biting wind. This was Martha Givens, a widow in her late 40s who ran the diner near the highway. She had a weathered beauty, gray streaks in her black hair, lines around her eyes from years of smiling at customers despite her hardships. Since her husband's death in a construction accident, Martha had raised 2 sons alone, her resilience admired by many, though grief often shadowed her gaze. Today she looked uneasy. "Sheriff," she began softly, "last night a stranger came into the diner. He kept asking questions about you, where you lived, who stayed in your house. He paid in cash and left before I could get his name." Ethan listened carefully, concern hardening in his chest. Martha's presence was another sign that trouble was closing in. Meanwhile at home, Emily wandered into her mother's old room, still untouched since Clara's death. Dust hung in the air, the scent of faded perfume lingering. On the dresser lay a small wooden box Emily had never dared open until now. Inside she found a delicate necklace, a silver chain with a locket that held her mother's picture. Tears welled in her eyes as she clutched it to her chest. Rook padded in behind her, his paws muffled on the carpet, and sat by her side as though he too recognized the sacredness of the space. For Emily, the necklace was not just jewelry, it was a lifeline, a tangible piece of her mother she could hold when everything else felt uncertain. That evening Ethan returned home exhausted, his boots caked with salt and snow. He found Emily in the hallway holding the necklace, her eyes fierce when he reached toward it. "Don't take it!" she cried suddenly, her voice breaking. "It's all I have left of her." Ethan froze, his heart twisting. He had only wanted to see it, but her outburst revealed the depth of her fear, that anything precious could be taken away. He lowered his hand slowly and knelt. "Sweetheart, I won't take it. It's yours. It always will be." Emily studied him with suspicion, but when Rook pressed against her leg, she relaxed slightly, still clutching the necklace but no longer shielding it from his gaze. Ethan whispered, "You miss her, don't you?" Emily nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Every day." Later that night, while Emily slept with the necklace under her pillow, Ethan sat in the library staring into the flames. His thoughts turned to Scarlett. The description from Dana, the stranger Martha saw, Everything pointed to his sister-in-law being tangled in the very web of criminals he was hunting. His duty as sheriff demanded he act, but his duty as father warned that confronting Scarlett would reopen wounds for Emily. Rook stretched out at his feet, lifted his head, and let out a low growl at some noise outside. Ethan rose, peering through the frosted window, but saw nothing beyond the swirling snow. Still, unease gnawed at him. The storm outside had passed, but another storm was building, one that threatened both his town and his family. The coal house went quiet as midnight deepened. Upstairs, Emily whispered in her sleep, clutching her locket, while Noah murmured in his crib. Teresa, awake longer than she should be, whispered a prayer in the kitchen for the family's protection. Scarlett's presence might have faded into the shadows, but her echo lingered in every fearful glance, every silence that filled the halls. Ethan knew tomorrow would demand decisions he could no longer avoid. The morning sun crept through the frosted windows of Pine Hollow, its pale light painting the snow in shades of gold. In the Cole residence, the atmosphere remained uneasy, though quieter after Scarlett's absence. Emily sat cross-legged on the rug in the parlor, her mother's locket hanging from her neck, a treasure she refused to part with. Noah babbled in his crib nearby while Rook stood guard, ears twitching at every sound. Ethan lingered in the doorway, watching silently. But when Emily noticed his presence, she quickly tucked the locket beneath her sweater and turned away. It was a gesture subtle yet sharp, a reminder that trust was still a fragile thing. At the sheriff's office, Ethan gathered his deputies, the quarry investigation now a priority. Marcus spread maps across the table, his sandy hair messy from lack of sleep, his restlessness evident as he tapped his pen against the county lines. Officer Dana Whitmore leaned over the reports, her steel-blue eyes cool and focused. She had interviewed more townsfolk and discovered sightings of trucks with covered loads moving after midnight. One man described the driver as a woman with auburn hair, Dana repeated, her voice steady. Ethan's jaw tightened. Every clue led back to Scarlett. In the midst of their planning, a knock echoed at the station door. Entering hesitantly was Caleb Jennings, a local rancher in his early 50s. He was broad-shouldered from years of work, his flannel jacket dusted with straw, his face rugged and tanned by wind. Caleb had always been respected in town for his fairness and blunt honesty, though a tragic barn fire years ago had left him wary of outsiders and deeply protective of his livestock. Today his weathered hands clenched his hat nervously. "Sheriff," he said, "2 nights ago I saw a truck cut across my pasture near the tree line. Didn't recognize the driver, but I swear I saw a woman jump down to open the gate, tall, thin, hair caught the moonlight red." The description left little doubt. Ethan thanked Caleb, promising to increase patrols, but inside his chest tightened further. Scarlett was no longer just a family problem. She was tied to the ring of crime threatening the county. Meanwhile, back at the coal house, Teresa bustled about the kitchen, determined to restore some sense of normalcy. She hummed softly while preparing stew, her wrinkled hands steady, though her heart remained heavy with worry. Camilla, the young maid, tried to make Emily laugh by fashioning a doll from scraps of cloth, but the girl only offered a faint smile before retreating to Noah's side. The household staff whispered their fears to one another. Scarlett might return at any moment, her temper sharpened by desperation. That evening, Ethan returned home later than expected, his face drawn, exhaustion clinging to him like the cold. Emily stood at the top of the stairs, the lamplight catching the silver chain at her neck. Rook was beside her, tail stiff, as though guarding her not only from Scarlett, but from every uncertainty that entered the house. Ethan tried to smile. "Emily," he said gently, "would you help me feed Noah tonight?" She hesitated, biting her lip, but Rook nudged her leg softly, coaxing her forward. Reluctantly, she followed Ethan into the nursery. There, Ethan clumsily prepared a bottle, spilling milk onto the counter. Emily stifled a giggle before she could stop herself. Ethan glanced up, surprised, and for the first time in months, her laughter reached his ears. It was small, fleeting, but it warmed him. He handed her the bottle, watching as she guided it into Noah's eager hands. Her movements were careful, practiced, almost maternal. Ethan's chest ached with both pride and guilt. His little girl had grown too fast in his absence. Later, when the children were asleep, Rook became restless, growling low at the back door. Ethan checked outside, but saw nothing beyond drifting snow. Still, unease gnawed at him. He knew Scarlet was out there somewhere, entangled with dangerous people, and that her anger toward him would not fade. Across town in a dimly lit bar, Scarlet nursed a glass of whiskey, her green eyes bloodshot. She sat across from a man named Gaspar Doyle, a mid-40s drifter known for shady dealings. He was lanky, with greasy blonde hair and a crooked smile, his reputation one of debts and broken promises. Scarlet's voice shook as she hissed, "I need money, fast." Gaspar smirked, tapping ash from his cigarette. "Money's easy. It's loyalty that costs." Scarlet's desperation pushed her closer to his schemes, weaving her fate tighter into the narcotics trade Ethan sought to dismantle. Back at the Cole house, Ethan sat alone in the library, the lamplight casting deep shadows across his tired face. He thought of Emily's guarded smile, of the locket she clutched, of Scarlet's descent into crime. He pressed his palms together, whispering into the silence, "God, help me protect them." At his feet, Rook lifted his head, amber eyes gleaming with quiet loyalty, as if to assure him he would not fight alone. The storm outside had calmed, but Ethan knew the true storm was still gathering. Scarlet's choices, the drug ring in Pine Hollow, and the fragile bond with his daughter that could break with the slightest misstep. For now, though, there was one sliver of light. Emily's laughter, faint yet real, echoing like the first crack in the walls of silence. The week dragged with an uneasy rhythm in Pine Hollow. Snow began to melt along the gutters, dripping steadily onto the frozen ground, but the cold remained sharp in the air. The Cole residence carried its own chill, not from winter, but from the fragile stillness that followed Scarlet's departure. Emily had grown slightly less guarded, sometimes allowing herself small moments of laughter when Rook nudged her hand or when Noah babbled nonsense, but her eyes still darted nervously whenever footsteps echoed through the halls. Ethan tried to fill the silence with presence, helping Teresa in the kitchen, reading clumsily to Noah, even repairing a broken hinge on Emily's toy chest. But trust was still something he had to earn piece by piece. At the sheriff's office, Ethan's work intensified. Marcus Hale paced the map-strewn room, his voice restless. "We can't keep waiting. If Scarlet's tied to the ring, they'll strike again soon." Officer Dana Whitmore leaned over the reports, her sharp gaze flicking between notes. "We need evidence that will hold in court," she countered. "Rumors and sightings won't be enough." Ethan listened, his jaw set. He knew Dana's past made her meticulous. Her father's abandonment had made her wary of loose promises. But Marcus's urgency gnawed at him. That afternoon, a new visitor arrived at the station. Frank Delgado, an ex-con in his late 40s with salt and pepper stubble and hands scarred from years and rough work, requested to see Ethan. Frank was thick-set, his once broad frame worn down by time, and his brown eyes carried both weariness and resolve. Known around town for keeping to himself since his release, Frank surprised everyone by stepping into the station. "Sheriff," he said, voice gravelly, "I heard you're looking into the quarry. I used to run with some men who knew about it. People are moving more than drugs through there. They're moving people." His words chilled the room. Marcus leaned forward instantly, but Dana narrowed her eyes, skeptical. Frank lifted his calloused hands. "I've done my share of wrong, but I won't watch kids get dragged into it. Not again." His past hinted at a loss he didn't name, but the pain in his face made Ethan believe him. Meanwhile, at the Cole home, Emily found herself in the garden, with Rook trailing close. The snow crunched beneath her boots as she stared at the bare rose bushes her mother once tended. She whispered to Rook, stroking his thick fur. She loved these, said they'd bloom every spring, no matter how cold the winter. Rook leaned into her touch, his amber eyes reflecting loyalty. For Emily, the dog had become not just a protector, but a confidant, one who never judged her silences. Teresa watched from the kitchen window, her heart aching. She later told Ethan, "That dog is doing more to reach her than words could." That evening, Ethan returned from the station, carrying the weight of Frank's revelations. He joined Emily in the parlor, where she sat curled with Noah. Carefully, he crouched near her, his voice soft. "Sweetheart, I know I've been gone too much, but I promise, I'll be here more. Not just as sheriff, but as your dad." Emily looked at him warily, her fingers clutching the locket, but before she could respond, Noah giggled and reached for Ethan's badge, tugging it. The moment broke the tension. Emily's lips curved into the faintest smile. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a step. Elsewhere in town, Scarlett's descent grew darker. She met again with Gasper Doyle, but this time in the company of another figure, Todd Halverson, a former social worker in his late 30s who had been dismissed years earlier for misconduct. Tall, lanky, with thinning blonde hair and a perpetual sneer, Todd now operated in the shadows, gathering vulnerable children and selling information to criminal rings. His gray eyes carried a predatory gleam, his demeanor oily yet commanding. Scarlett, though bitter and proud, looked uneasy in his presence. "You want money?" Todd said coldly. "Then you deliver information about the sheriff, about his movements. Do that, and your debts disappear." Scarlett clenched her jaw, realizing too late she was ensnared. Back at the Cole house, the night deepened. Ethan tucked Noah into his crib while Emily lingered in the doorway. She finally whispered, "Will you stay until he falls asleep?" Ethan nodded instantly, settling into the chair by the crib. Emily climbed onto her bed, watching from across the room as her father's head slowly nodded with fatigue, his body slumped but his presence steady. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to close her eyes without fear. Rook lay between their beds, a silent guardian bridging the distance between father and daughter. As the house drifted into slumber, Ethan knew the fight ahead would test him like never before. The quarry, Scarlett's betrayal, Todd's shadow, chains that bound his family and town alike. Yet, in the quiet, with his daughter finally breathing evenly in the safety of his watch, he felt a resolve stir within him. Some chains, no matter how heavy, were meant to be broken. The wind howled again through Pine Hollow, carrying with it the sting of sleet and the promise of another storm. Within the Cole residence, the hearth burned low, shadows dancing across the walls as the family prepared for a tense evening. Ethan had returned late, his boots heavy with mud from the quarry, his mind filled with Frank Delgado's warning of human trafficking. Emily sat on the rug, Noah in her lap, and though she glanced at her father when he entered, she quickly looked away, the silver locket gleaming at her throat. Rook rested at her side, tail curled neatly, eyes fixed on Ethan as if gauging his intent. That night, Ethan could not rest. He paced the library until the embers dimmed, then stepped outside into the biting air. He lit a lantern and checked the perimeter of the property, every sense sharpened by unease. Rook padded beside him, ears erect. The dog's nose twitched, catching scents carried on the wind, and he gave a low growl toward the woods. Ethan scanned the darkness, but saw nothing, only shadows shifting between trees. He whispered, "Stay close," and Rook obeyed, a living shadow of vigilance. Elsewhere in town, Scarlett Ward met again with Todd Halverson in a decrepit warehouse near the rail tracks. Todd leaned against a crate, his lanky frame draped in a shabby coat, his sneer illuminated by a single dangling bulb. Scarlett's auburn hair was tangled, her once proud features worn by sleepless nights. Todd's voice was sharp, commanding. "The sheriff knows too much. If you want your debts cleared, you'll give us something useful. His patrol schedules, the times he leaves the children unguarded." Scarlett's green eyes flickered with conflict. She wanted escape from the noose of debt, but the thought of betraying her sister's children gnawed at her. Still, desperation made her nod. Todd smirked, sensing her capitulation. Back at the sheriff's office the next morning, Marcus Hale slammed a file onto the desk. His sandy hair was wild, his face red with frustration. "Sheriff, another truck slipped past our checkpoints. We're losing ground." Officer Dana Whitmore, her dark hair tied in its usual severe ponytail, scanned the report with cold efficiency. "We need more men, or we need to cut off their supply routes." Ethan listened, but his thoughts kept circling Scarlett. He knew she was tied to the ring, yet the evidence remained circumstantial. If he struck too soon, the case could collapse. If he waited, lives could be at stake. In the midst of this tension, a new figure entered the office, Sarah Klein, a social worker in her early 40s. Sarah was tall and slender, with streaks of gray in her chestnut hair and eyes the color of storm clouds. She wore a heavy wool coat and carried herself with a quiet dignity, though her face bore lines of fatigue. Years spent advocating for children in broken homes had both hardened and softened her. She was stern with bureaucracy, but gentle with those who needed her. Sarah placed a folder on Ethan's desk. "Sheriff Cole," she said firmly, "we've received reports about your sister-in-law, Scarlett Ward. Several townspeople claim she's been associating with known traffickers. I need to know if your children are safe." Ethan stiffened but nodded. "They're safe with me. Scarlett won't touch them again." Sarah studied him, her gaze piercing. "See that they remain safe. Children carry scars from silence as much as from violence." Her words lingered long after she left. That evening, the Cole household prepared for supper. Teresa ladled stew into bowls, her wrinkled hands steady despite the heaviness in her heart. Camilla, the young maid, set out bread, trying to mask her nervousness with a forced smile. Emily sat stiffly at the table, her locket tucked beneath her sweater, while Ethan watched her with quiet longing. When Noah knocked his spoon onto the floor, Ethan bent to retrieve it, but Rook was already there, tail wagging faintly as he nosed the spoon back up. Emily giggled softly, a sound so rare it drew every eye to her. Ethan smiled faintly, cherishing the brief warmth. The moment fractured when glass shattered in the back hall. Rook bolted upright, barking furiously, his body tense. Ethan rose instantly, his hand on his holster. He strode toward the noise, Rook at his side, only to find the window broken and footprints in the snow leading toward the trees. Someone had tried to enter. Ethan's pulse thundered. He called for Marcus to send deputies to sweep the woods, but deep down, he knew. Scarlett was tightening her net, emboldened by Todd's schemes. Emily clutched Noah, her hazel eyes wide with fear. Ethan knelt beside her, his voice steady though his heart pounded. "You're safe. I won't let anything happen to you." Rook pressed against Emily, his body a wall of fur and muscle, eyes locked on the darkened window. The room filled with the scent of fear and resolve. Ethan understood that the battle was no longer distant. Scarlett's war had reached his doorstep. Later, when the deputies returned empty-handed, Ethan stood before the family and staff in the parlor. His posture was straight, his gray eyes burning with determination. "No one in this house will live in fear again," he declared. "From this night forward, I will take responsibility for every life under this roof." Teresa wiped tears from her cheeks, Camilla clutched her apron, and Emily stared at him with cautious awe. For the first time, she did not look away. Instead, she reached for his hand, small fingers trembling yet firm. Ethan felt her grip and knew the walls between them were beginning to crumble. The storm that had rattled Pine Hollow eased by morning, leaving the town cloaked in brittle stillness. Frost painted the windows of the Cole residence, catching the early light in sharp, glittering lines. Inside, the atmosphere remained taut, every sound amplified, the creak of floorboards, the whistle of the kettle, the faint coo of baby Noah from his crib. Emily sat at the dining table with her locket glinting faintly at her throat, her gaze fixed on the steam rising from her mug of cocoa. Across from her, Ethan studied her carefully, his jaw firm, his storm-gray eyes resolute. The attack on their home had been a message, and he knew who had delivered it. At the sheriff's office, Ethan convened his deputies. Marcus Hale leaned over the desk, his sandy hair disheveled, frustration etched into every line of his youthful face. "We can't keep reacting," Marcus snapped. "We need to strike first." Officer Dana Whitmore, ever composed, sat upright with her arms crossed, her steel blue eyes sharp. "Not without evidence," she countered. "If we rush in and fail, the entire case could collapse, and worse, Scarlett walks free." Ethan listened, his silence heavy. He thought of Emily clutching his hand the night before, of her trembling yet deliberate trust. The responsibility pressed on him like a weight he could no longer ignore. That afternoon, another visitor arrived, Pastor Julian Reed, a tall, lean man in his early 60s. His hair was silver, his eyes kind but grave. Years of tending to Pine Hollow's spiritual needs had left him with a calm presence, though sorrow clung to his shoulders from the loss of his own daughter decades earlier. He stepped into Ethan's office quietly, speaking with deliberate gentleness. "Sheriff," he said, "Scarlett is lost, but I fear her desperation will lead her to harm those closest to you. Do not underestimate the fury of a soul that feels cornered." Ethan nodded, absorbing the warning. Meanwhile, Scarlet sat in a rented cabin on the outskirts of town, her green eyes bloodshot, her auburn hair tangled from restless nights. Gasper Doyle slouched across from her, his greasy hair falling into his smug grin. Todd Halverson paced the room, lanky frame twitching with nervous energy. "You had your chance to play it safe," Todd hissed. "Now you're in deep. If you want out, you'll do as I say. You'll deliver the sheriff, his patrol routes, his blind spots, even his children if necessary." Scarlet flinched, her face hardening, though guilt twisted in her chest. She wanted freedom, but she also carried the ghost of her sister's voice, Clara's soft laughter that sometimes echoed in her dreams. At home, Ethan attempted to rebuild a sense of safety. He spent the evening helping Teresa prepare supper, his large hands clumsy with chopping vegetables, drawing a rare giggle from Camilla. Emily sat quietly with Noah on her lap, but her eyes followed her father. She noticed the way he leaned over to taste the stew Teresa had seasoned, the way he carefully checked the locks before dusk fell. Later, when Noah cried, Ethan lifted him gently, pacing the parlor until the child's sobs quieted. Emily watched from the staircase, her small hand gripping the rail, a flicker of admiration softening her wary gaze. That night, the family gathered in the parlor. Ethan stood before them, Teresa with her apron folded, Camilla wringing her hands nervously, Emily clutching her locket, and Noah nestled against her shoulder. Rook lay at Ethan's side, ears pricked, eyes alert. The fire cast shadows across Ethan's face, but his voice was steady, his presence commanding. "This house has lived too long in fear," he declared. "Scarlet's shadow ends here. From this night forward, I am not just the sheriff of Pine Hollow. I am the father of this family, and I will not fail you again." The words resonated through the room. Teresa wept softly, Camilla nodded with relief, and Emily stared up at her father with wide, searching eyes. Slowly, hesitantly, she stepped forward and slipped her small hand into his. Her fingers were cold but firm, her grip unyielding. Ethan's chest tightened with emotion, and for the first time in months, he felt the bond of family weaving itself back together. Outside, the night deepened. Scarlet's fury boiled in her cabin hideout, Todd whispering schemes into her ear, Gasper smirking at the prospect of easy money. But inside the coal home, a line had been drawn. Ethan's oath was not simply words, it was a promise sealed in the gaze of his daughter and the loyalty of the German shepherd who never left his side. The sun rose behind the jagged peaks of Montana, gilding the frosted pines with gold. Pine Hollow seemed hushed, the streets empty except for plumes of chimney smoke curling into the sky. In the Cole household, breakfast was quiet, but warmer than it had been for months. Teresa hummed as she poured porridge. Camilla carried in fresh bread from the oven, and Emily sat close to her father, the silver locket nestled against her chest. Noah slapped his hands on the high chair tray, squealing at Rook, who sat faithfully by his side, tail swishing across the wooden floor. The German shepherd, now 7 years old, had grown heavier in the shoulders but retained his sharp eyes and instinctive vigilance. Every sound outside still drew his attention, and this morning was no exception. His ears flicked toward the back window, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Ethan placed a calming hand on the dog's back, though his own unease mirrored the animal's. Later that morning, Ethan drove into town to meet Marcus and Dana at the station. The investigation had reached its breaking point. Frank Delgado, the ex-con trying to redeem himself, had provided another lead. Todd Halverson and Gasper Doyle planned to move their operation that night, using Scarlet as their inside link. Marcus, pacing as usual, was eager for action, his sandy hair sticking up in restless tufts. "Sheriff, we can't wait. We cut them off tonight or they'll vanish." Dana, with her clipped tone and calm eyes, agreed but urged strategy. If Scarlet's involved, she may still be persuaded to testify. If not, she'll fall with them. Ethan's jaw tightened. He didn't know if Scarlet could be saved, but he knew his children could not endure another assault on their home. Meanwhile, Scarlet sat in the cabin with her hands trembling around a glass. Todd towered nearby, his lanky frame bent as he rifled through papers, his pale hair falling across his gaunt face. His gray eyes gleamed with a feverish hunger for control. Gasper, greasy-haired and lazy-eyed, leaned against the doorframe, smoking and smirking. "Tonight we bleed the town dry," he drawled. Scarlet closed her eyes briefly. Images of Clara, her sister, kind and gentle, flickered in her mind. For a moment her resolve wavered, but Todd's hiss cut through. "Don't think of the past. Think of the debt. Think of freedom." Scarlet clenched her jaw, sealing her choice. At sunset, Ethan returned home and gathered his household in the parlor. Teresa sat stiffly in her rocking chair. Camilla twisted her hands in her apron, and Emily clutched Noah close while Rook stood at her feet, hackles bristling. Ethan spoke plainly, his storm-gray eyes unwavering. "There may be danger tonight, but you will not be alone. Marcus and Dana will be nearby. Rook and I will not let harm touch you." Emily's hazel-green eyes searched his face, and after a pause she whispered, "I believe you, Daddy." The words struck him like a benediction, a fragile trust reborn. Night fell quickly, the forest cloaked in shadows. The deputies surrounded the quarry while Ethan, Rook at his side, moved through the trees. Snow crunched softly beneath his boots. Suddenly headlights flared, a truck grinding into the clearing. Todd jumped from the cab, his angular body lit by the beams. Gasper followed, his smirk fading when he saw figures emerging from the dark. Marcus, Dana, and 2 deputies, guns drawn. Scarlet stepped down last, her auburn hair catching the light, her green eyes wide. She froze at the sight of Ethan. For a heartbeat, the world stilled. Todd spat. "You're too late, Sheriff." He lunged toward Scarlet, seizing her arm as though to use her as a shield. Scarlet gasped, caught between fear and shame. Gasper tried to flee, but Marcus tackled him, the 2 men crashing into the snow. Dana advanced steadily, weapon aimed, her voice sharp with authority. "Drop her, Todd," Todd snarled, pressing a knife to Scarlet's throat. It was Rook who moved first. With a ferocious bark, he surged forward, his muscular body colliding with Todd. The knife clattered into the snow as Todd tumbled back, cursing. Scarlet stumbled free, clutching her neck, her eyes brimming with tears. Ethan rushed in, restraining Todd with iron strength, the deputies snapping handcuffs onto his wrists. Gasper lay groaning in the snow, already subdued. The ring was broken. Scarlet stood trembling, her face pale, her lips quivering. She met Ethan's eyes but could not speak. Shame drowned her. But there was also something else, a faint glimmer of relief that her descent had ended. Ethan's voice was steady but sorrowful. "You'll answer for your choices, Scarlet. But know this, Clara would have wanted me to protect her children, and I will." Scarlet bowed her head, silent tears freezing on her cheeks as the deputies led her away. When Ethan returned home near dawn, the sky was pale with the promise of day. Emily rushed to him, Noah in her arms, Rook padding proudly at her side. She looked up at him, her voice trembling. "Is it over?" Ethan knelt, drawing her close, his arms wrapping around both children. "Yes, sweetheart, it's over." Rook nudged Emily gently, tail wagging. Teresa and Camilla watched from the doorway, tears streaming freely. For the first time in months, the Cole house felt whole again. Ethan stood tall in the pale light, Emily's hand clutching his, Noah's soft weight against his chest, and Rook by his side. The chains of fear had broken. Light filtered through the pines, washing the house in gold. And in that fragile morning, the Cole family began to heal. In the end, what we witnessed was more than a father protecting his children and a loyal German shepherd standing guard. It was a reminder that even in the darkest hours, God can bring light and healing where we thought only fear could live. Miracles are not always thunderous. They often arrive in the quiet courage to change, in the embrace of family, and in the faith that we are never alone. In our daily lives, when we feel overwhelmed or abandoned, let us remember that the Lord is near, ready to turn sorrow into hope. If this story touched your heart, please share it with others, leave a comment, and subscribe so we can continue spreading messages of faith and love. May God bless you and your family abundantly. And if you believe in the power of His miracles, write Amen in the comments below.